Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure this afternoon, to introduce an important seminar series that's very important to me, and I hope very educational for all of you. This is co-hosted by the Center for Global Security Research, CGSR, the Nuclear Weapons Program, Weapons and Complex Integration, as well as our Global Security Directorate. As the first in a series of briefings to discuss a range of topics, with today's being understanding the eroding security environment and what's at stake. Future talks will cover topics around Russia and China nuclear weapon developments, the new nuclear posture review and its implications, and the direct impact of our work at Lawrence Livermore that all of you are so involved in. I want to make a few opening remarks before introducing our speaker, Dr. Brad Roberts. All of you have heard me in various town halls and through our WCI strategy talk about what I consider to be our imperatives, which are to deliver and to transform. Deliver because the nation has entrusted us as the design agency lead for the W80-4 and the W87-1 stockpile modernization programs. These are the first two weapon programs in the stockpile stewardship era to make significant changes to the nuclear explosive package in order to meet military requirements, and to be developed simultaneously with new delivery platforms, the Long-Range Standoff Cruise Missile and the Sentinel, formerly GBSD, ballistic missile. But that is not enough. We also must transform the complex and use our innovative Livermore culture to make the nuclear security enterprise be more agile and responsive. As you will hear more about in this talk, the global nuclear security landscape has become more complicated and dangerous. And at the same time, our timelines to deliver stockpile modernization programs are longer than a decade and increasing, not decreasing. We believe we need to dramatically accelerate our ability to deliver as a country. In doing this work of delivery and transformation, we have a few experts who've done this work before, and we're fortunate to learn from them every day. And we've been able to hire very talented people in the lab to do this work, but we are in fact training a new generation of people, the majority of which have been at the lab less than 5 years, who are delivering these programs. Every chance I get, I listen to staff concerns, and one has been, Brad, I don't know exactly how what I'm doing connects to the larger mission or connects to national priorities. When I hear this, I think this is something I can do something about. This is something our laboratory can do something about, because we are involved in many different ways in understanding the threat and responding to it, and is really, for me, the key motivator for this seminar series. We are fortunate at our lab to not only have an outstanding weapons program, but to also serve the US government with the nation's leading analytic capabilities as it pertains to foreign nuclear weapons through our Global Security Directorate and through the Center for Global Security Research, led by our speaker today, Dr. Brad Roberts. Center for Global Security Research, or CGSR, has been exploring the challenges in the new security environment since Dr. Roberts became its director in 2015. The work has catalyzed broad national and international thinking about the requirements of effective deterrence, assurance, and strategic stability in a changed and changing security environment. They have also kept a spotlight on Russia and China's aggressive nuclear modernization and changes to their nuclear doctrine. As Brad will discuss today, and I like to say we have exactly the right number of Brads at the laboratory, so not too few or too many. The leaders of Russia and China and North Korea are increasingly confrontational and risk acceptant. US allies are increasingly anxious, and America's resolve has on occasion been in doubt. Our national leaders have regularly called for a strengthening of deterrence and for improved competitiveness, and we are working as a nation to respond to this call. We will then look at what's at stake and how crucial it is for the US to adapt its deterrence strategy and posture at the speed of relevance. Before, as I just transition, I would also like to give a bit of a more historic introduction to Brad Roberts. We're very fortunate to have him lead CGSR and provide guidance to the lab senior management team on important national security issues. Brad became the director in 2015 of CGSR, and prior to that was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear and Missile Defense Policy from 2009 to 2013. In this role, he served as policy director of the Obama administration's Nuclear Posture Review and Ballistic Missile Defense Review and led their implementation. He continues to advise leaders in government, both civilian and military, and serves as a member of the U.S. Strategic Command's Strategic Advisory Group, or SAG. He is the author of a book entitled The Case for U.S. Nuclear Weapons in the 21st Century, and his most recent publications include Orienting the 2021 Nuclear Posture Review in the Washington Quarterly of July of last year. He received his doctorate in international relations from Erasmus University, Rotterdam, the Netherlands. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Brad Roberts and thank him for being with us today.
Thank you, Brad. Thank you for the kind introduction. Thank you for the opportunity for partnership in this lecture series, and I'm grateful to be a part of the lab's continuing discussion of the security environment and our role in it. I'd like to begin by being clear that the views I express here are my personal views. These are not laboratory views, not our sponsors' views. They're just my personal views. I do have some slides, and I'd ask Katie to go ahead and bring those up. Thank you. And I will work through the slides. The last few are a bit of an eye chart, but I figure everybody's got a screen in front of them and can work through them. There will be some time at the end for discussion, and at that point, we'll ask you please to raise your hands electronically or to send in something in the chat function. What I wanted to do is bring home to you the pressures that have been generated by changes in the security environment. It took me a while to think of an approach to doing so that might be particularly effective, and it occurred to me that I could build a few stories around a trip I took last month. I had a very challenging 31 days in Washington, D.C., Omaha, Nebraska, Brussels, London, and Paris. Challenging, not so much because the days were long and full of meetings, but because everywhere I went, people were feeling under intense new forms of pressure about the effectiveness of deterrence and, frankly, also the reliability of the United States. So let me go forward to the next slide, Katie. So I'm going to talk through a few perspectives from these four different venues, and then come very explicitly to some implications for what's at stake and for the role of the nuclear enterprise. Next slide, please. Brussels, of course, the discussion is all about, is the war in Ukraine going to expand? And even if it doesn't expand, is it going to end up with implications and lessons that erode the environment of the NATO alliance? There was a lot of discussion of what Putin was after, and he gave us a very clear answer in 2014. The new rules or no rules phrase comes from the speech he gave when he announced the military annexation of Crimea. He said, let's call the strategy of the West what it is by its proper name. It's encirclement and containment, aimed at keeping Russia weak and denying it its rightful place in the world. 2 months ago, he set out in this document from the Foreign Ministry what he saw as at stake, what he sees as at stake in the European order. And he's very clear. The last bullet, in the absence of the readiness of the American side to agree, Russia will be forced to respond, including through the implementation of military technical measures. There's more than Ukraine at stake here, and his ambition doesn't stop at the edge of Ukraine. Next slide, please. I have a couple of slides to capture the ongoing NATO discussion about what kind of war is Putin fighting. Russian military doctrine distinguishes 3 levels of war: local war, regional war, major war. Each has a specified role for the use of force. And I think what we're seeing in Ukraine, what Russian military experts have described in Ukraine, is what Russians call local war. It's not regional war. Regional war is where force is used to localize a conflict to keep it from becoming a major international war. And Russia has put its best minds on this problem of regional war, beginning really with the Kosovo War in the 1990s. But for 20 years, they have put their minds on the solution to this problem, and they have an entirely new approach to regional war in comparison to the one they had during the Cold War. And you can see it involves the employment of nuclear and other strategic weapons to, quote, sober but not enrage the enemy. What does that mean? Underlying the basic Russian view of its security environment is that any conflict on its periphery will involve its vital interests, even if it's only a, quote, local war. And those interests will significantly outweigh whatever interests the United States might have, even in a regional war. It might have reputational interests, it might have the commitment to its allies, but it won't have interests of a vital character analogous to those of Russia. Sober, but not enrage your enemy by escalating. Next slide, please. And this is just a further elaboration on Russian military thinking about how to use its new strategic toolkit to induce the restraint from us that it wishes us to exercise. And the red and the black simply demonstrate the tight intermingling of conventional and nuclear displays and operations and strikes and counterstrikes. This is an integrated deterrence strategy. Next slide, please. And if I was a little less anxious after my trip, well, last week brought new deterrence messaging from Russia. I'll give you the opportunity to read the bullets. The nuclear danger is serious and real. There are few rules left now. We have all of the tools for this, things that no one else can boast of. We will use them if necessary. We've already made all the decisions. Pretty alarming threats. Next slide, please. So the second stop on this journey was U.S. Strategic Command. Brad mentioned that I'm a member of the Command's advisory group. There, the command is, well, you've read Admiral Richards' quote here about China's strategic breakout. China is very much an immediate concern for U.S. Strategic Command. But let me just give you a brief quote from his testimony yesterday to the Senate Armed Services Committee. Quote, "We are facing a crisis deterrence dynamic right now that we have only seen a few times in our nation's history. The war in Ukraine and China's nuclear trajectory, their strategic breakout, demonstrates that we have a deterrence and assurance gap based on the threat of limited nuclear employment." A lot of anxiety at Strategic Command about how viable deterrence and assurance are in the current moment, not in 2030 when China has 1,000 nuclear weapons, not in 2036 when it's got many more, but today and tomorrow. Lots of debate about at Stratcom and elsewhere about what explains China's buildup. Are they simply responding to developments in America's missile defense posture? Do they have aggressive intentions? Is this just a legacy competing with the neighbors to have a modern triad? Well, again, President Xi, just like President Putin, very straightforward, has said that he's developing, he's committed to a, quote, significant increase in strategic capabilities in order to ready China to be at the center of the world stage in the dominant position. It's difficult to find the word parity or peer status in that concept. Next slide, please. If you consider that prior chart that talks about the growth in China's nuclear arsenal, it would lead you to think that the problem of China's growth is in the longer term future, a decade from now. The New START treaty was extended last year. Could be extended once for 5 years, and it will expire in 2026. And at that time, if you were to use the starting rule, the counting rules in New START to count China's nuclear force, you'd see that it has not the same number of deployed warheads, not on a comparable scale, but still a significant number. But on delivery systems, right up there at peer status with us. And the nuclear weapons are expected to fill in not far beyond this timeline. We also have done an excursion analysis on this, looking at the tripolar nuclear balance in 2036 under both a baseline assumption and a worst case assumption. In a worst case assumption, the number of counterforce targets for the United States more than doubles. Of course, our nuclear force is not going to more than double, and by 2036, it's not going to grow at all. Next slide, please. I'm sorry, one last thought on the US-China topic. Either, given that growth in China's nuclear force, either our nuclear force as deployed will have to increase, and that may be sooner rather than later, or our nuclear deterrent strategy will have to change somehow. And of course, if we choose to do neither, we will be confirming the perceptions of many that we are not as serious as we once were about nuclear deterrence, and that we are in decline and retreat, a common point of discussion in the East Asian, Indo-Pacific environment. That quantitative analysis also doesn't talk about the developments in China's ability to deliver nuclear weapons within the theater, which is growing, isn't large, is growing, and we'll watch carefully where it goes over the next decade. But STRATCOM doesn't just think about Russia and China. It also it thinks about any country that may create the extreme circumstance in which the United States is called upon to consider the employment of nuclear weapons. North Korea, while we're all debating Ukraine and China's nuclear breakout, North Korea is just plodding along, more than plodding, making good progress in developing the long-range delivery systems it seeks, and the nuclear weapons to deploy atop those missiles. And amidst all of the nuclear signaling last week from Russia, most people missed this bit of signaling from Kim Jong-un, a very interesting statement, a very alarming statement. The fundamental mission of our nuclear forces is to deter war, but at a time when the situation we are not desirous of at all is created on the land, our nukes can't just be confined to this single mission. They will have to decisively accomplish an unexpected second mission, which must be about the employment of those weapons for the purpose of addressing the situation of which he is not desirous. Next slide, please. Third stop. Well, there were multiple stops in this endeavor. There was a day in London with the British National Security Advisor and his team for a nuclear immersion day. They simply wanted to spend a day getting smart about nuclear weapons, nuclear history, nuclear deterrence theory, and current nuclear challenges and NATO's approach. I spent 5 days in Paris, jammed with meetings talking about similar topics. But we also convened a 2-day workshop on extended deterrence in this new security environment, and a number of themes jumped out at us. But a little background first. U.S. allies, not all of them, but many of them, feel themselves to be under increasing nuclear pressure from their neighbors who seek to remake regional orders and who put these countries in their crosshairs. Kim Jong-un regularly says, when asked to describe the circumstances in which he might employ nuclear weapons, he has said, count on it, the first will go on Tokyo. And we tend to hear that and think this is a reflection of the historic poor relations between Japan and North Korea. It has an entirely different genesis. The conventional defense of the Republic of Korea, of South Korea, depends on South Korean military forces, American forces deployed in South Korea, but a lot of forces under the United Nations flag in Japan. And their dispatch from Japan requires the approval of the Japanese Prime Minister. And in the 1950s, that was a no-brainer. Kim Jong-un was trying to make it a brainer. He's trying to force the Japanese leadership and the Japanese public to debate whether they really want to run these nuclear risks in service of another country with which they're not allied and have many political difficulties. The anxiety in Japan that they're in the nuclear crosshairs is in governmental circles high, and in some public circles rising. And extended deterrence plays a central role in preserving the regional security orders that Putin, Xi, and Kim are trying to remake. The U.S. extends deterrence to its allies with threats, assurances, forward deployed weapons in Europe, which are a part of NATO's nuclear sharing arrangements, and the promise to make forward deployable assets available globally in support of any ally or partner. Next slide, please. Our workshop brought home the fact that the anxiety of many allies is rising. They are the victims of increased nuclear coercion. They have long-standing, deep, and continuing worries about what America might do when it discovers itself at new nuclear risk in time of crisis. Will it be decoupled from their defense? A Cold War term, which has come alive again in the current security environment. And they worry about American politics and our willingness to run risks and bear costs on their behalf. I was asked repeatedly on this trip, what do you Americans think when we look back 10 years from now, who will have been the aberration? Which American president will have been the aberration from America's trajectory? Will it have been Trump or will it have been Biden? We have no answer to that question. It eats away at their gut as they face these new nuclear risks, that there's a big question about American commitment to them. We talked a lot about the two near-peer problems, so a security environment in which we have Russia and China to deal with at the same time. If we find ourselves in major conflict with one or the other, that's a good moment for the other one to engage in opportunistic aggression, or at least to act in some way that pins us down and makes it difficult for us to prosecute our interests vis-a-vis the other major power. This has got extended deterrence problems written all over it. It implies that in time of a major war, American military power in one region may be dramatically reduced, shifting the deterrence burden onto allies who don't really have the means to bear the burden. We also had a lot of talk about the interesting decisions by Germany and Japan. Japan not having made a decision, but the former prime minister starting very visibly a national level discussion about whether more NATO-like extended nuclear deterrence relationships wouldn't be in Japan's interest. We also had some very interesting discussion from East Asian allies about the latest nuclear posture review, which was described most compellingly by one participant, one East Asian, as too timid for the security environment we live in and nibbling at the margins of some very hard problems. Next slide, please. The NATO discussion was, of course, in part about the extended deterrence topic. When I was Deputy Assistant Secretary a dozen years ago, this NATO nuclear issues were in my portfolio. And I have some institutional memory that the alliance doesn't really have anymore. So we had a lot of discussions about the credibility of NATO's nuclear posture in the current European security environment. NATO's nuclear posture consists of hardware and software. You can see both declaratory policy and capabilities described here. NATO has these unique sharing arrangements where US nuclear weapons are deployed into some of these countries, but the hosts own and operate the aircraft and would deliver the weapons in time of war under the authority of the American president. You'll note the upper right-hand graphic. From 1991 to 1998, the United States withdrew over 90% of its nuclear weapons from Europe. It withdrew 100% of its nuclear weapons from East Asia and from naval surface combatants and from the attack submarine force. So a significant contraction of this capability. And the 2021 summit communique, which I've cited here, stated in that final bullet that NATO reaffirms the imperative to ensure the broadest possible participation in the sharing arrangements. Every summit communique since 2008 has described, reaffirms the commitment of the alliance to the broadest possible participation. This one finally said, this is an imperative, and it said it because there's been no progress, a little progress, no substantial progress in broadening that burden. Next slide, please. What is the state of NATO's nuclear deterrent? Well, let me take you back to 2008. You may recall, some of you, that there was an embarrassing incident in which the US Air Force flew a weapon thinking it was a dummy from one base to another in the United States. This prompted a Secretary of Defense level investigation, which found a serious erosion of senior leadership attention, focus, etc. You can read the bullet. They did a close look at NATO and found all of the problems of the US Air Force replicated in Europe, and they made 5 recommendations. Let me illustrate why they made one of the recommendations about adaptive planning, point number 4 there. The map on the right. So NATO says it's an alliance without enemies. It also says it doesn't maintain nuclear plans against any country, but it wants to maintain an ability to adaptively plan for nuclear employment. So how does it do that? It creates a fake view of the world. Notice there's no Africa, but there are some islands. Notice that there's also a large island to the northwest called Atlantis, whose capital just happens to be about the same distance from Brussels as Moscow is from Brussels. And this was the way NATO thought about exercising adaptive planning until they stopped doing it altogether after the end of my watch. This was how it was done on my watch. Next slide, please. So if the task force were reconstituted today, what would it find? Well, yes, NATO's got a small but ready force of dual capable aircraft and can respond if struck by nuclear weapons or for other reasons. Modernization of the dual capable aircraft has been underway for years. You know, my first visit to NATO as a DoD official, I had to announce the delay of B-61 modernization and the delivery of the F-35 until 2015. Well, here we are 7 years later. And there is still no deployed modernized capability. You can read these bullets. The punchline is NATO's made essentially no progress in adapting its nuclear deterrent in the manners it has said it wants to in the intervening 15 years. This may have something to do with President Putin's willingness to be risk accepting. He may perceive that he's not accepting much risk, or wouldn't be doing so if he were to cross the nuclear red line. Next slide, please. So all is not well when it comes to deterrence in Europe. All is not well when it comes to dealing with China's strategic breakout and North Korea's continued nuclear arming. All is not well on extended deterrence, where in Europe we have a weak posture, and in East Asia we're dependent on the weak European posture. What about Washington, D.C.? Well, it was, of course, a very interesting moment to be in Washington, D.C. I heard from quite a few senior administration people that the Ukraine war is our 9/11. It's shifted the way we look at everything we came into government to do. I heard that from leaders in the nuclear community. I heard it from leaders in some of the other strategic domains, but I heard it from a lot of others working a lot of other problem sets. From the narrow perspective of the problems of deterrence, extended deterrence, strategic stability that I've introduced here and that were underlying all of these interactions over this long trip. From that narrow perspective, there's some good news. The contours of this new security environment have come into focus. We were focused elsewhere for a long time. We were focused on the war on terrorism in Iraq and Afghanistan. But we've now had two national defense strategies in a row that have looked at this new security environment and identified its main new features. We have in the Biden administration's national defense strategy, at least according to Sasha's testimony, we have a commitment to sustain and strengthen deterrence. This is these are steps in the right direction. Next slide, please. And the administration has a pathway to doing so. Apply integrated deterrence. Well, we all wonder what they mean by integrated deterrence, and we'll see when they finally release their national security strategy, national defense strategy, and nuclear posture review, all now long delayed because of the Russian war against Ukraine. When those are released, we'll see what there is in the way of substance to this idea of integrated deterrence. It may simply be an excuse to further reduce the role of nuclear weapons. It needs to be something much more than that, and there are mixed signs that it might be. Secondly, appropriately tailor forces to achieve deterrence and assurance and strategic stability benefits. Third, take a disciplined approach to modernizing strategic capabilities. And by that, you can see they've included modernization of the DOE and NSA infrastructure and made a significant commitment in that regard. And against this backdrop was again the continuing discussion of what kind of America are we going to be in 2 or 3 years? Will we be pursuing joint activities with our allies to sustain and strengthen deterrence and defend the world order that we helped build and is now under assault? Or will we be the America of the 1930s? There's a lot of discussion about historical analogies, which are the right ones to understand the current moment. Many, many people think we've turned a very large corner and we're looking down a new street and don't know what the street is, so we're looking for analogies. And the alarming analogy for me was the analogy of the 1930s, but this time with nuclear weapons, and maybe not as a source of restraint for the major powers, but as a tool for used by Russia and China, used broadly, not just employed, but nuclear weapons utilized as a part of their campaigns to remake the regional and global orders. So I wanted to paint a picture for you of the real pressures that real people are feeling who don't sit on our square mile in the middle of the wine country, and the sense in all of these places that we've turned a very large corner and are at some new peril today, a peril that we have a difficult time calibrating. So let me now turn to implications, and this is where we come to the I charge sorry. Next slide, please. 2 slides on summarizing the key features of the security environment. Russia, I've talked about. China, I've talked about. The fact that they've both developed theories of victory for confrontation and conflict with the United States and its allies. They've been at work on this since the 1990s. We've been at work on it in a somewhat leisurely way since 2014. Talked about North Korea. Didn't mention Iran, but it's of course deeply opposed to what it sees as US hegemonism. It's deeply opposed to the order in the region that the United States has long backed, and it's committed to continuing to move towards having nuclear weapons, and may not be far behind North Korea in its nuclear ambitions. 6, I've spoken about the problem of opportunistic aggression when you've got a multipolar security environment. I didn't talk about 7, but this is an important key feature of the security environment. The legacy arms control regime is crumbling bilaterally, the multilateral elements as well, and the foundations of strategic stability as we have known them are slipping away. Next slide, please. So rounding out my discussion of implications or key features of the security environment. I didn't talk much about the technology environment. You all know that it's dynamic and making conflict much more complex. Didn't talk about shifting strategic balances much. Russia has its nuclear weapons delivery, both warhead and delivery system production lines going at full speed. China, same thing. We're getting started, but we're started on a replacement program. They are on programs that are much more ambitious, and our abilities to compete are comparatively advantageous to them and not us. I'll come back to that in a minute. Point 10, the potential for a nuclear tipping point and a cascade of proliferation remains. Many states have latent nuclear capabilities on purpose, and many of those who are potential members of the cascade are our allies. And those allies are increasingly anxious. We have spoken about that. For a long time, we used the words allies and partners almost interchangeably, but always in common. And in the current security environment, it's the partners who are emerging as the weak links in the regional orders. Ukraine is a partner, not an ally. Taiwan is a partner, not an ally. This is a problem for which we don't seem to have a very good solution. And it's very common for American summaries of the security environment to not discuss the United States as a factor in the security environment. We're a key factor. We have many strengths and many weaknesses, and both of those are a source of concern for allies, partners, and adversaries. So an historian has described the long peace that has existed between the major powers since 1945. It's still a useful concept. We have many sources of conflict and competition with Russia and China, but we haven't been at war against each other. And we have to recognize that this long peace is at growing risk. Next slide, please. This is the worst eye chart, sorry, but I wanted to get everything onto one slide so that you could read it and compare the pieces together. But these are implications for our deterrent strategy and posture. Strengthen and adapt and strengthen. Reference there to the National Defense Strategy Commission of 2018. It reviewed the defense strategy of the Trump administration and the then existing posture and concluded that if we found ourselves in a regional war against a nuclear rival, we could well lose. We're in a dangerous place. Second implication, we cannot now go further in reducing the role of nuclear weapons without creating greater nuclear danger. But we must have a strategy for doing so. We must compete effectively in the new domains, but this requires breaking down some barriers. We must shift more of the deterrence burden to our allies. There are some barriers to doing this as well. Extended deterrence plays a central role in preserving existing regional security orders, yet it depends on legacy approaches that are poorly aligned with emerging requirements. Strategic nuclear deterrence plays a central role in preserving the existing global order. And while the U.S. pursues stockpile stewardship and replacement of aging out delivery systems, Russia and China are, quote, modernizing, expanding, and adapting for new requirements. Seventh, in a strategic environment marked by increased volatility, the capacity of the U.S. defense industrial base also plays a central role in our posture. It's a hedge against geopolitical and technical surprise. Russia and China have the means to surprise us, to generate new forces at scale and quickly, and we're struggling to remedy our shortfalls. You heard Brad reference the long and growing timelines for stockpile stewardship. And we've made apparently little or no meaningful progress in trying to respond to high-level political requirements to improve our adaptation so that we are capable of responding to developments at the speed of relevance. Point 8, in a competitive environment, you need to outthink your adversary. Seems straightforward. We have an awful lot of national confidence in our ability to outthink our adversaries. And I think a lot of that confidence has gotten in the way of doing the necessary outthinking. We've been hubristic at the wrong time here. And moreover, we're dealing with the fact that the peace dividend of the 1990s involved harvesting out of the system a lot of the capacity for strategic thought that was a lot of the capacity that was created in the Cold War. Ninth, adaptation is useful in its own right, but it also sends an essential signal of political resolve to adversaries and allies. If an ally calls the current nuclear posture review too timid, I wonder what President Putin calls it. And though it may be dismissed as a political slogan, integrated deterrence must result in near-term tangible progress in reaping synergies and covering capability gaps. So if the punchline on the discussion of key features of the security environment, if the punchline was the long piece is at risk, the punchline here is the preservation of the long risk requires more than business as usual. Business as usual has put us into this pickle. Next slide, please. So how do we think about our pathway out of this? Well, I think this set of alternative outcomes has sharpened the issue for me. The worst case, it's a plausible worst case, is that deterrence will fail. It's already partially failed in Europe. A plausible, not worst case, is that deterrence will prevent aggression, but not effective coercion, and that we'll find the existing regional orders slipping away. The result will be an isolated America in a world dominated by two major hostile powers. I don't see an alternative future here in which the regional orders collapse and we are then able to live the way we would like in a peaceful environment. We would be the victim of hostile major powers. Best case, deterrence will prove strong enough and will serve, and the crisis will serve to remind us of the value of international leadership, etc. So I'm coming to my last slide. I'd like those who would like to put questions into discussion. There are quite a few in the chat function, but more animating to people when people join the conversation in person. So please raise hands if you'd like to do so in that manner. So how do we get the best case, and what's our role in the nuclear enterprise? Well, I think of it this way. We got to deliver the baseline mission. If we can't deliver capabilities on time, the erosion of deterrence will accelerate. This is the wrong decade in which to not be able to deliver stewardship on time. Second, we need to reimagine and re-engineer the enterprise so that it has the, as you can read there, the innovative acumen, technological adaptiveness, production efficiency, and manufacturing scalability of America's world-leading private sector manufacturers. Those words are in quotes because they come from an essay written by the directors of the three labs together, published in a new CGSR publication that came out last month, and that offers their vision of what the enterprise should become over the next few years. If we can't do those things, we're not going to recover from our current substantial vulnerability to nuclear competition. Thirdly, we must embrace the technology competition with Russia and China, with China in particular, and purposefully seek the disruptive benefits of new military applications. We've spoken about this at the lab as being the business of creating new strategic advantage for the United States. We have to recognize that Russia and China are trying to do exactly the same thing. And if we don't compete, the advantages will accrue in a one-sided fashion to them. Fourthly, we need to take on integrated deterrence as a substantial and a priority project. We should be identifying synergies across the domains, gaps between them, and operational solutions. If we fail to do these things, our adversaries will be tempted to exploit our vulnerabilities. They already are. And I think a final and very important long-term response to the loss of outthinking capacity is the development of new communities of interest with Livermore at the center, working on issues at the intersection of national security and science and technology. We don't do these things, we won't be out innovating. So Curtis LeMay, the original head of Strategic Air Command, often said that peace is our profession. And that remains the case for the nuclear enterprise. And I think peace is, as I suggested, the long peace is at risk. And the failure of the long peace would bring catastrophic results for us and our allies. And thus, doing these things, going beyond business as usual to build a new nuclear enterprise, pretty important.